Hi, Eli.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
Pretty good. How you doing?
Good.
Welcome to Blogging Heads for your second visit.
Yes, it's great to be here.
Great to have you. You know, I don't know if you know this, but Mickey Kaus is taking the week off.
No.
And one of Mickey's jobs, of course, is to get me so irate that I start yelling and screaming and generate video that will haunt me for the rest of my life, you know?
Yeah, I'll try to do my best.
Could you please? I was thinking, you know, since after all you are, you know, you're like a columnist at a neoconservative newspaper, and that's ideologically more or less the polar opposite from me. I was thinking you might be able to get me to do something embarrassing.
Well, for this Blogging Heads appearance, I reread your American foreign policy that both realists and idealists should fall in love with on progressive realism, and I think we have a lot more in common. I hope that doesn't.
Do you?
You might be irate at this point. Yes.
Well, in that case, listen, I got to go, Eli. I'm looking for conflict.
No. There's plenty we'll disagree about.
Okay. Well, and I've got to say, you know, I was really disappointed when I saw your first appearance with your friend Spencer Ackerman.
Yes.
Because it's always disappointing when you see that someone you think is an ideological antagonist turns out to be an apparently likable guy. I mean, that complicates life. And I had the same reaction to your boss, Seth Lipsky, the editor of the New York Sun, when I met him in New York. Prepared to hate him, just couldn't manage to do it though. After I met him.
I think you're alone because I remember the comments.
Because you do. The
commenters were all over me. I mean, I couldn't get a break.
Wait, say that again. I'm sorry.
The commenters on that appearance with Spencer, they were merciless.
Were they?
Yes, they were.
We pride ourselves on having merciless commenters.
Yes.
You're not the first victim, and you won't be the last. And I've been one pretty recently, I might add.
Yes.
So, anyway, so, you know, as I told you, one thing I was hoping you'd do is give us something like a thumbnail definition of neoconservatism. I know you don't consider yourself a spokesperson for the cause or anything.
Right.
But you would say you more or less are in that realm ideologically. Certainly the Sun is identified as a neoconservative newspaper. Neoconservative is a term that's thrown around a lot and rarely defined. And when you talk to people, it turns out they have very different conceptions of what it is.
Yeah, I did a little research on this question, and just to sort of kind of refresh myself. And the first definitions of neoconservatives almost refer to a group, a split among the left when you're talking about the first generation of Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz, which is that they looked at their colleagues and they said, well, you know, I think you're too soft on the Soviet Union, hence starting a migration that led them on domestic policy to criticize the welfare state in the 1980s and embrace Reagan, to split with most of the Democratic Party in 1968 and later 1972 on the Vietnam War, and later, you know, it's a persuasion, as Irving Kristol says, and it really is almost describing your political migration more than it is describing a sort of set of ideological principles, the way that someone who would call themselves a neo-Marxist or a libertarian might, you know, have a sort of set of beliefs that they have, and they're connected to policy positions, and you know, you have to sort of buy into the whole thing.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because it does seem to me that along the migrational path there have been there's been a little swerving. I mean, and you probably heard this. I mean, one of the early well-known foreign policy documents identified as neoconservative was this Jeane Kirkpatrick thing that distinguished between authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. And at the time, I mean, these days, neoconservatism is identified with a very strong emphasis on democratization and a real aversion to authoritarian regimes and a reluctance to be very nice to them. And in those days, her argument, I doubt I ever actually read it, but the secondhand version I recall is that she was saying, look, let's don't get confused between really, really bad and not so bad. Totalitarians, China, Russia in those days were totalitarians, are, you know, out and out evil. But if we have to cozy up to a brutal right-wing authoritarian regime, you know, in Latin America or something, as part of the war against the totalitarians, you know, there are worse things in life than merely authoritarian regimes. So she seemed quite pragmatic, not at all hung up on bringing freedom to peoples everywhere anytime soon. And most people sense that there's been some sort of shift of emphasis here. Is that wrong?
Well, a couple things to say. First of all, that essay was written for commentary as a reaction to President Carter's emphasis on human rights as applied universally, including a lot of our friends at the time who were clearly despots and authoritarians, but they were our authoritarians, or to use the Eisenhower phrase, our sons of bitches. The most obvious example is that many on the right never forgave Carter for what they saw as the betrayal of the Shah, which was that it was unclear even if we would accept the Shah at one point in the middle of the Islamic Revolution. And I think that that's what the chord that Jeane Kirkpatrick was striking at the time. It should be said that Robert Kagan wrote in 1997 a rebuttal saying that the paradigm no longer applies in a world.
Well, that's the swerve I'm talking about, though, as we approach modern times. And just a footnote, I believe that Reagan, as I recall, was no friendlier to deposed dictator Ferdinand Marcos than Carter was to the Shah. But that is
true.
I guess neither here nor there.
Well, I mean, but the difference being that that Marcos, was ushered out as a result of a democratic movement and a democratic election, whereas the Islamic Revolution, while there was a referendum on the original constitution, quickly turned into a kind of Jacobin purge.
As I'm sure you'd agree, after 4 years of the Iraq War, getting rid of brutal dictators can be a messy business.
It certainly can. I mean, I can't. I'm not going to argue. You're not going to get an argument that Iraq is doing terrifically well right now and everything is going according to plan. I don't know anybody who makes that argument as on Iraq right now. But sort of along your lines, I think that a lot of what you were saying about. I think you were using in your essay, and it has been really influential on progressive realism, that you kind of...
But the essay has been influential?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've seen
First
a lot
I've
of
heard of it. God bless you. Go ahead.
Okay. But I think you raised some interesting questions, but I think your characterization of neoconservatism in this essay, where you say the de facto position of neoconservatives is that invade countries that possess weapons of mass destruction...
I was trying to save space, Eli, but
I hear you.
But go ahead.
But my point is that I don't think it's necessarily that simple, and I think that you are correct in your criticism of the realists, in that there is a role for there to be an endpoint of getting rid of authoritarians. I think that in this point, a lot of neoconservatives would clearly agree, and that there is also a point in saying it's in our national interest to promote democracy, which is another key point. And I don't see that as a neoconservative idea. That's a very American principle. I mean, I think that that's what motivated, in some ways, our support for anti-communist parties in Greece, for example. It's a policy decision that a lot of American presidents, right and left, have adopted. The disagreement, I think, today would just be on the utility or what you can reasonably expect from the United Nations. And that strikes me as a second-order disagreement and not really a grand ideological one.
Oh, I don't think that's the only disagreement.
Right.
I mean, it's true that in opposing the Iraq War, one reason I did it is because we had kind of stumbled upon an opportunity to really nourish the United Nations and build up its credibility as an arms control, an instrument of arms control. It would have been a wonderful precedent in the evolution of the United Nations if we had demonstrated that this can work. You have these kind of forceful, intrusive inspections, and if we had stayed there with inspectors, another year, and Bush could have certainly got permission to do that from the Security Council, we would have successfully ensured that a nation had no nuclear weapons, without invading it. And that would have been a wonderful thing. That's one reason. That's one thing I think we really sacrificed in going to war, that the possibility of that precedent. But that's not the only thing. I mean, there's two other differences I point to between me and neocons as I understand them, both of which bear on the Iraq War. One is a time frame question. Over what time frame is it crucial to bring democratization to as much of the world as possible, ultimately all of the world. I think when you look at the nature of the unfolding threats, particularly involving the evolution of more accessible weapons of mass destruction, bioweapons, and so on, which I think is really a long-term problem. Nobody actually even was claiming that Saddam Hussein had a truly massively dangerous, for example, biological weapon, because everything we thought he might have was either not contagious, like anthrax, or we had a vaccine for it, like smallpox. But what I worry about is in the future, you know, the accessibility of biological weapons of truly epic proportions, accessibility to terrorists. So I think in the long term, we've got to do the things that we think are anti-terrorist measures, and I do think free market democracies tend to have that effect. Whereas there was a sense of urgency among the neocons. No, we've got to do this now. We've got to do this now. The other big difference is how you do it, how you bring democracy in. And this is where I think there's a real irony in neoconservatism, which is I have more faith in the ability of free markets to nurture democracy than neoconservatives have. And I feel sure of that because if you compare our views on China, right, I say, you know, this is not a time to be, you know, threatening China over perceived shortcomings in human rights and so on, because the thing that is progressing in China, which is economic liberalization, tends to be accompanied in the long run by political liberalization. Now, if China decides it can't handle the political liberty and cracks down, then it will do that, but it'll only do that by constraining the economic liberty and sacrificing its own prosperity. So those are, I think, two differences between me and neocons. I don't think the democratization project is urgent, and I think technological evolution is on its side because more and more you need these empowering information technologies, that is to say, popularly empowering technologies for prosperity. And I think, again, the economic liberalization in this technological context tends to entail political liberalization. So I think those are real differences, but you may differ.
Well, first of all, I don't know that many conservatives right now who are calling for war with China. I mean, I think that there was a concern about the threat from China, and it's largely one about how they're building their military, the threat to Taiwan. But I think that the view that you've just expressed on how anyone who's been to China, I've been to China, can tell you that it's pretty remarkable how, at least in the cities on the coast, or in Beijing, where I've been, how the prosperity is quite tangible, and there is a bet that eventually the political liberty will follow, and we've seen that obviously with things like you've seen more newspapers and issues of local corruption, and hopefully that these things will sort of spread. And we also can say that it's a Chinese process. I mean, there's very little that we can do about that or affect the outcome. I mean, it'd be nice to sort of help dissidents in China speak out for them in international fora, but that's about it. In the case of Iraq, I think 9/11 really changed the outcome. One of the misconceptions is that, for the most part, neoconservatives and what ended up being, ironically, their bureaucratic foes like Richard Armitage and Robert Zoellick signed on to the idea of political support for the Iraqi opposition. That Iraqi opposition obviously included Ahmed Shalabi, who I still think has been is by no means a perfect figure, and I could get into a lot of detail about him, but has been in many ways kind of unfairly maligned, and we haven't seen as many stories that are just as scandalous about some of his other colleagues in the opposition. But that aside, the argument was, let's support with air power at most, similar kind of like, I guess, an Iraqi-Contra operation, a large-scale group of people. This is pre-9/11, a wide Kurdish, Shia, secular, ex-military opposition who would sort of run a rolling rebellion from the areas with Saddam where Saddam's forces were not. That was the idea, was not invade countries that are not free. And I think that there were a number of reasons why after 9/11 people supported a more robust plan to bring about regime change in Iraq. one of the ones that was most persuasive to me, I don't know if this is a neoconservative argument, it's one we most would associate with Christopher Hitchens, was that we were intertwined in Iraqi history, and it was, I thought that the Colin Powell Pottery Barn rules was a lie on two levels, or it was wrong on two levels, I should say. One, which the Pottery Barn rules, of course, being if you break it.
One is that at the Pottery Barn itself, that rule does not actually
exactly
apply.
The rule doesn't apply in the pottery.
Not what you had.
No. Right, but if you break it, you own it. Which is to say that Iraq was already very broken, and we had already, to a degree, owned it because we were patrolling the airspace in 2/3 of the country. And we had been responsible for this crippling sanctions which Saddam had been exploiting and deliberately malnourishing his people for a kind of propaganda victory. And if you go back further, we sold him wheat credits in the late 1980s as he was gassing the Kurds in Halabja through the Anfar campaign. And even before that, we allowed, we sort of, and ironically, it was the Zbigniew Brzezinski who did not really protest too much and even may have indirectly encouraged through contacts with King Hussein, for Saddam to launch his disastrous war with Iran, and even to a certain degree his brutal ascendancy. So the people who kind of knew the American history with Iraq, not to mention the fact that we had our allies sell Iraq weapons in the Iran-Iraq war and managed through Operation Staunch, except for the hostages for weapons deal, to deny those. The same sort of armaments from the Iranians. I mean, I just think we'd already meddled, we'd already offshore balanced, to use a realist term of art, in Iraq, and that it wasn't so simple from my perspective or my calculus to simply say, well, we don't have much of a role here. Does that say, in retrospect, that we should have invaded the way that we did on the timeline we did? I mean, I don't think anyone can reasonably argue that, given how things have turned out. But I think that there were a variety of reasons for supporting the invasion before it.
Okay, and maybe.
Yeah, if I could just there's one last point, if I could, and it's not, and I want to say that, I mean, I took a jab at your piece, which I thought was good, but I thought that was a responsible piece, and there are plenty of very good, people criticize what they see as sort of neoconservatism, and that's fine, but there is what I would say a kind of pernicious literature out there that is on the far left and maybe the far right to a certain extent that says that neoconservatives are a de facto extension of the Likud party in Israel. And I think that this is, it's wrong. The main thing is that it's wrong. But it's also, it's pernicious in that it skates close to making neoconservative a synonym for kind of, the octopus of Jewish influence. And that view, I think, if you look at the Likud Prime Minister Netanyahu in the 1990s, he didn't take any of the advice that of this famous clean break memo that has been cited a lot by David Wurmser. And, also, if the influence was Israel into America, then don't produce a memo from an American to an Israeli. And furthermore, the Likud party had accepted, or at least under Netanyahu, had accepted the tenets of the Oslo Agreement. A lot of Paul Wolfowitz had and Bernard Lewis had as well, by the way, so there was a lot of disagreement on that. So the notion that neoconservatism is really just greater Israelism, I think is wrong. And the other reason why that's wrong is that the Israelis have shown no interest in promoting or in any way even caring about whether their neighbors were democratic. In fact, they wanted Arafat to be ever stronger during the Oslo process. And to be ever more arbitrary in his crackdown against Hamas and other terrorist groups. So the fact that there was a critique at the time, though not as popular in the 1990s, and more so with Natan Sharansky, that said, well, one of the problems is that that Palestinians need democratic institutions, and that's the way to really guarantee Israel's security. That's a view that we would have to say is almost the polar opposite of what Likud prime ministers actually wanted at the time, which were more decisive action against terrorists, more arbitrary detentions, there was never, Netanyahu never said, look at what a sham show trial these are against these alleged terrorists. I mean, he never said that, but there were some Israeli neocons, at least at the time, who were. So that's my little point on that.
Okay, so you would say, first of all, on your list of misconceptions about neoconservatism, not an extension of the Likud party.
Yeah.
What about the question of? We talked about the emphasis on democracy and human rights. Okay,
yeah.
But there. I mean, it kind of gets at, like, what was the central purpose of invading Iraq? Yes, and this gets, to my mind, to the contradiction that was built into the invasion of Iraq. Okay, yes, the idea was to usher in democracy. Also, the idea was clearly to create a platform for the exercise of American power. We were building these permanent military bases. It was absolutely part of the plan, so far as I could tell, to make American military might more feared in the region. And it seems to me I mean, first of all, this gets to two different sides of neoconservatism that both seem to me to surface. One is an emphasis on what you might call long-lasting American global hegemony. Maybe you'd consider that an exaggeration, but that's what seems to me.
Well, don't we all want long-lasting American global hegemony? And isn't that everybody wants that, right?
No, I do not think that the secret to the future security of America or the stability and peace of the world is ongoing American military hegemony.
In fact, military hegemony. I mean, perhaps. I mean,
Well, actually, no. I mean, look, the power you have in the real world is proportionate. The power you can exercise is proportionate to the power you have. America is right now the richest, most technologically advanced nation in the world. I'm pretty sure that will not always be the case. You don't have to use your imagination much to look at China and India and say this won't always be the case. So when that's no longer the case, I think we would be fools to try to preserve hegemony. And yet I really think I have seen it as an explicit, I don't know whether I'd say an explicit part of neocon doctrine, an explicit doctrine of the weekly standard, I believe, that, no, America should plan to remain the dominant player in the world, I think forever, right? I mean, am I wrong about that?
Well, I mean, listen, anybody who's going to have a discussion that's going to be speaking to power about foreign policy for the country has to frame it to a certain degree in how to maximize or extend our hegemony. I mean, the argument that I remember from the Clinton years was we better invest in global institutions because we may not be the global hegemon forever, but if we get some rules that are to our advantage, then we'll do okay when we have hegemonic competitors. But right now, I mean, I think if you were to argue, like, what's the most cutting criticism against the Bush administration, it's that it's so incompetent that it is weakened our ability to influence other nations. Our standing in the world has decreased considerably. More people hate us. This is the critique of a lot of folks coming from the kind of left sphere, but they're framing it in like, I want to get more people to respect American power and like us. And I think that when I sort of hear about this sort of thing, or, I'm on the far left, a Chomskyan would say that one of the reasons he's against the extension of American hegemony because it's antithetical to human rights or the self-determination of oppressed peoples. But I would argue that it's the best of any alternative that I see on the horizon. So I'm a proud American hegemonist, and I hope to keep American hegemony going for as long as possible.
Well, okay, let me say.
But I mean, would you be that too, though? I mean, aren't we all that? Is that a controversial,
I will come to that.
Okay.
Let me first say that the application of the I kind of strayed from the original point about the Iraq War. The point about the Iraq War is I was saying there was this paradox built in, which is, we're going to use this as a military platform. We're going to make it a democracy. Yeah. Well, what if it happens that when it's a democracy and the Iraqi people start expressing their voice, they're actually not enthusiastic about our using their country as a platform from which to menace their neighbors and tend to the interests of our ally Israel? Certainly no reason to think that your average Muslim nation in the Middle East is going to be wildly enthusiastic about serving the interests of our ally Israel anytime soon. So I just didn't understand how these two things were supposed to go together.
Well, you've hit on what I think is the fatal paradox of the Bush administration's.
Yeah.
I actually, you might be surprised, Bob, but I mean, I wouldn't frame it exactly the way that you said it. I think that what you had in Iraq was a lot of different agents within, some of it the former elements of the Ba'ath Party, Al-Qaeda, which I think we'd have to say to a degree is a foreign actor, though there are Iraqis or more Iraqis than Al-Qaeda in Iraq right now. But, you know, they managed to do their banking in Syria and Jordan. I mean, the Iranians, I think, at this point have played a really awful role in Iraq, particularly as it regards the cleansing of Baghdad, though that seems to have tamped down. But anyway, the assumption was, oddly, which doesn't make any sense to me, and I don't know if this was a neoconservative assumption or just the result of kind of a bureaucratic Solomonic ruling, that it was in Syria and Iran's interest, and they really wanted to see Iraq become a democratic state, when that would actually be an enormous threat to them for reasons independent of Israel. Just if you had the exercise of political freedoms that were not available, not on offer to Egyptians or to Saudis or Iraq's neighbors, then it would probably spur other peoples to demand those same sorts of rights if it worked out in Iraq. So I saw there was always going to be a conflict between Iraq's neighbors and whatever a democratic outcome that came next. But it seemed that until very recently...
Well, not just that, but between a democratic outcome and our own aims within the borders of Iraq, right? I mean,
well,
were you
that
confident these people were going to love the idea of American military bases that were going to be used in the interest of us in Israel?
Well, you know, I at this point would sort of bracket Israel for just a second, because I don't know that, you know, Iraq, I mean, there was some Salon.com reporting, like, in 2004 that I don't think was exactly right on that. But I would say that there have been opportunities in that elected body for there to be a majority of people to sort of say, we want the Americans out by a certain time, and they haven't done it. And I don't think the reason they haven't done it is because Zalmay Khalilzad is a terrific arm twister. I think at this point they realize that the only thing keeping first of all, this fragile government together at this point is the American presence, and secondly, that there is an interest in having in preventing a full-on civil war, which is really what we are doing right now in Baghdad. We are at least temporarily stopping that. So I'm not so sure that it's that simple. But that said, you know, in the beginning, in the first year or so of the occupation, and a lot of neoconservatives today would say it was a mistake from the beginning to call it an occupation and to treat it as such, but that's another separate issue. But from the beginning, there were plenty of Iraqis who were delighted that we had gotten rid of this, you know, masochistic, pornographically violent, family-owned mafia state that Saddam ran. And it was a disgrace that he was afforded any of the accoutrements of sovereign equality, given, you know, what an extraordinarily awful despot that he was. And I think that a lot of Iraqis were delighted that we had gotten rid of them and looked forward to the prospect of, voting in elections and having rule of law. Now, there were also a lot of people who looked forward to the prospect of settling scores against their former ethnic tormentors, and there were a lot of people who looked forward to just sort of sabotaging the prospect and killing as many random civilians as possible. And those people, Zarqawi, it looks like he won in the short term because he did manage to overrule the more moderate voices, people like Ayatollah Sistani, who were urging people to sort of participate in this political solution. But I don't think that there was necessarily that kind of deeper resentment that you're. I'm not saying I knew for sure you couldn't square the circle and wind up with a democratic. It just seems to me that our plans kind of presuppose that you could have it both ways, and it seems to me that certainly shouldn't be the default assumption. And what I'm suggesting more broadly is that this is kind of a contradiction. First of all, I'm suggesting that this contradiction does flow from neoconservatism itself.
On the one hand, there is this emphasis on democratization. On the other hand, there is this emphasis on American hegemony through the use or threat of use of military force. It's a primary instrument of influence, I think, as far as I can tell, in the neocon arsenal. So I'm saying that paradox within the plan to invade Iraq was a paradox that extended, from neoconservatism, and I think to some extent it's a paradox that would apply outside the borders of Iraq. I mean, if on the one hand you want to go around bringing democracy to all parts of the world, on the other hand you want America to be hegemonic and when necessary to do so through a strong military. What you actually may find is that a lot of these democracies, do not comply with your wishes. And it may actually make you less hegemonic in the end. But the main thing I'd say is that this just seems to me a fundamental contradiction built into the idea of the Iraq War, and it seems to me to flow from neoconservatism.
Well, I mean, I just don't see using American force in that way is not a uniquely neoconservative idea. You would grant that, right? I mean,
there's no idea in any ideology that is unique to that ideology.
Okay,
right? But it's very different from my ideology.
Right. Okay, but you would also concede that there were lots of people who were not neoconservatives who, at the time, supported the war for different reasons, right? There were.
Yes, but at least some of them didn't emphasize. Well, yeah, fine. I mean, I would say the neoconservatives were unusual in their emphasis on the two contradictory impulses, but fine. I'm sure non-neocons shared that, yes.
Okay, and I would argue that given if you look at what, say, someone like Michael Ledeen has been writing about Iran, he doesn't say, let's even bomb Iran. He doesn't say, let's invade Iran. He says, let's just figure out a way to support the internal democratic opposition there. So the argument that Iraq is a repeatable thing, that that a neoconservative wants to invade Syria and Iran. I mean, I think that's just not true. I don't know anybody who says, let's invade Syria, let's invade Iran. I mean, it's militarily implausible at this point, and that the argument is instead that there's a natural, or there should be, in Iran, by the way, I've covered a lot of the Iranian opposition. I don't necessarily think they would take American help, or at least direct American aid at this point, but my point here is that there is at least this notion that, American power in all of its many facets should align with Democrats, because it is in our nature and our character as a nation to help people who are striving for liberty. That's a neoconservative idea, and I would argue it's also a fairly liberal idea. Am I wrong about that? I mean, wouldn't liberals generally sort of support that proposition?
Yeah, it's a liberal idea. I'm just saying that you should be, well, one thing I'm saying is that you should be ready for the possibility that you're not going to like what the democracy produces, at least in the short run. And this actually would bring us to the Hamas issue, which we're planning to discuss next anyway. But I'd like to first say one more thing, go way back to a point of departure. And I think it's been so long. I think what we were talking about was it was about how you were saying, don't I champion American hegemony for as long as we can have it, kind of.
Yeah. I mean, that's not controversial.
What?
That's not controversial, is it?
Well, I mean, the way I'd put it is, first of all, if you either follow world history or have common sense, you will realize it's not going to last forever.
I agree with you. I certainly agree with that. It will not last forever.
And if you follow current events, you'll realize that there actually may be a fairly rapid shift of relative power. I mean, if the China experiment stays on track, okay, we're not talking decades from now before there's a significant shift of world power in the direction of China, maybe of India. Conceivably, if a miracle happens and the European Union shows more unity than it's shown, conceivably you could see relative power grow there. But in any event, it's certainly possible that the kind of unipolar world is just not very long for this world. And so I would say one thing you do is build structures. I mean, I would say it's very likely that the unipolar moment is not going to last terribly long, in my view. I would say build international structures that ensure that America's security is not premised on America's military domination and economic domination of the world, because that's not going to last. So that's one reason I'm in favor of building the kind of multilateral institutions that, so far as I can tell, neoconservatives are much less enthusiastic about as a general matter. It seems to me one feature of the neocon character is just suspicion of multilateralism.
Well, I want to just respond to that last point. I don't think that neoconservatives are suspicious of multilateralism. I think that traditional conservatives raise sovereignty questions, as you point out, with, having to submit American power to, kind of collective veto of the NATO or something like that. But I would argue that I don't think we're going to get effective multilateral institutions, Bob, unless we start establishing second- and third-class international citizens. I mean, what is North Korea doing? We can't. That's a state. I've been to North Korea. I went there with Madeleine Albright. That's a state that can't feed its people, 4 months out of the year, 5 months out of the year, depending on what it is. They deliberately starved an entire province. This has nothing to mention the fact that there is still, there is evidence now from people who've left North Korea that there were Mengele-like biological experiments on people there. It's a disgusting state of affairs, and it's not what the UN Charter had in mind. And that I am all in favor of having multilateral leagues of democracies, as it were, or, and this is an Albright idea, having a community of democracies.
Yeah, I hate that idea. But
all right, fine. I know you would hate that idea. What I'm saying is that if in certain cases, it would be nice to have an agreement with the Iranians. It would be nice to have that. We have an agreement, I guess, now with North Korea. But I just don't think that we can expect, as Saddam proved, that traditional diplomatic measures would have the sanctions, as it were, could have the same effect on a state's behavior if between open society and closed societies. We had an effective embargo and then this oil for food program with Iraq, and it actually managed to strengthen the position of the dictator. Whereas if Iraq was a democracy, the government that would endure that kind of sanction and censure wouldn't last 5 months. And there's a huge difference in that respect. And also, if you're a transparent country like, we are, or the European countries are, you have, a parliament or Congress, and you've got all these records, and the government has to issue reports and so forth. Nothing like that exists for countries like Iran or North Korea. So why do we assume that they are going to be induced by being members of the International Monetary Fund? The last thing the Iranians or the North Koreans would want would be a bunch of international accountants to find out how much money they've been stealing from their people all these years, right?
Well, wait. First of all, your position isn't really, as I understand it, that they wouldn't want to do that. Your position is that we shouldn't give them the chance. What you're saying is the participation of a state in these multilateral institutions should be premised on whether it is democratic and respects human rights and so on. So you just leave it for North Korea to decide what they would and wouldn't do. My point is you won't even go that far. And secondly, just on a point of history, you said the United Nations certainly did not have in mind North Korea. Actually, it totally did.
All right, fair enough. I see where you're right.
Yeah, the United Nations Security Council, the whole idea was that if we're going to stop war in the world, we cannot we cannot be kind of passing judgment on the internal conditions of all these nations. Job one is stopping war. There are some very bad nations that are very powerful. Stopping war is going to take the cooperation of powerful nations. So Russia and China, totalitarian nations, were admitted to the Security Council. And so, and the spirit of the UN is very much a realist spirit. Now,
well, it also has, as you know, the UN Charter also has these wonderful words about rights of individuals. And but
if you look at where the emphasis was and where the muscle was, it was the Security Council and stopping war. There were lots of nice ideals out there, and they are wonderful ideals.
And guess what? By the way, it's not done a great job in stopping war, as I think people would look.
No, I was just correcting the point.
No. And what I was referring to was that the UN Charter does talk about expectations for the rights of individual people as well.
Right.
And I'm not saying, by the way, that it means that there shouldn't still be a UN. I mean, I guess you need to. I mean, I'm not arguing for sort of a radical surgery. One, let's lower expectations, and two, I think that it's important for democratic countries to cooperate. I mean, it'd be wonderful if there was some sort of fund of all open societies to support those striving for open societies in other countries, so it doesn't seem like it's coming from America, which makes it impossible in some ways for people really good people to accept sort of money. More importantly, I just don't know what you're going to get. I mean, I don't have any faith in this North Korea deal, in part because I've seen how the North Koreans have responded to this other stuff before, and I just don't think that there's really much we can do. I'm not arguing for invading North Korea. You can't do that. They would incinerate Seoul, and nobody wants that. I'm just saying that we should probably lower our expectations for what we can get with these kinds of rogue states.
Okay, well, we should move on. We should move on beyond this broad philosophical discussion. The asterisk I'd add. I don't want to be mischaracterized on my feelings about the UN. The world has changed since the UN was started, and the main change is that a main change is more and more internal conditions within nations actually do impinge on America's security.
True. That's what I like. By the way, that's what I liked about the essay. I liked about your New York Times essay.
Well, it's certainly true.
Yeah.
But an example is, it would be nice to know that Iran and North Korea, well, it's too late for North Korea, but it would be nice to know that any given nation is not making nuclear weapons if we think that that's inconsistent with our national interests. But in the case of nuclear weapons, at least, this is less true of some other weapons of mass destruction, potentially. In the case of nuclear weapons, if the question is, can a sufficiently intrusive and forceful agreement keep you confident that they aren't building nuclear weapons, even if they aren't democracies and aren't especially transparent societies and don't respect human rights? The answer is yes, in principle. I agree with you that past agreements with North Korea have not been sufficiently intrusive and forceful. But if job one is to keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of terrorists, and you would add out of the hands of rogue states, although I think the main problem with them being in rogue states is them somehow getting into the hands of terrorists. I say, look, we cannot afford to spend too much emphasis on human rights at the expense of job one, at the expense of keeping nuclear weapons out of the hands of these people. And I personally think that in the long run, the whole plan I outlined, if I had time to outline it, is in the long run the surest path to human rights and democracy everywhere decades from now.
Okay, well, the one thing I would say, though, is that you do have a problem in that when states like it's Zimbabwe, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, these kinds of countries do get together and have gotten together in the UN, and they all get on the UN Human Rights Council, and they manage to prevent any kind of censure or criticism of themselves, and they beat up on Israel. And the problem is I don't want them to have equal rights within the UN. I mean, I would almost prefer, like, if you represent a regime that conducts horrific experiments on political prisoners, then you have to sit at, like, a separate lunch table at Turtle Bay. You know what I'm saying? It's like there should be ways to ostracize them within the international community. They can only serve on the equivalent of the UN's Merchant Marines Committee. Treating it like, one of these guys who was like, in Congress, there have been a couple of, lawmakers who have been, convicted of crimes and managed to still serve at times. And there is a sort of ostracization. That, I think, is important. And it's also, and we should try to keep them out of the most important committees, particularly in the case of when they're kind of pipsqueaks. If they're not that terribly powerful, if they're not China or what the Soviet Union was, so we have to have a deal, they have to be at the table for the UN Security Council for it to mean anything, then you can't serve on the Security Council. And they can huff and they can puff and they can not like it, but I just think that that's the way to sort of bring back the integrity in some ways to the UN and to these international institutions. That's my idea.
I mean, the way it's set up is that human rights abusing pipsqueaks, in fact, do not have much power at the UN.
I know they don't, but they managed to get on more committees than Israel.
Fine, and if it bothers you that they're on committees, but if you look at where the power is, the permanent members of the Security Council, there aren't any that fit that description. But anyway,
okay.
We should. We always try to divide these things into
topics. I know,
topics.
but this was good, though.
This is going to be a total mess. I'm going to have to hire new people for this one. But it's been fun so far. But let's move on to an actual topic. We were going to talk about what the U.S. should do with Hamas, I guess.
Yes. Okay.
And the brief question is, well, it started with this election of Hamas, and here we get back to the fact that, democratization can have outcomes you might not love. And in this case, Hamas wound up with power after this election, and the U.S. and Israel didn't like that. And so Because, among other things, I mean, or primarily, Hamas's traditional position was not to recognize the legitimacy of Israel as a state.
Still is their official position.
Still is their official position. Yeah. And the question after the election was, do you make your recognition of the government and your continued provision of financial aid, and even actually the continued transmission to the Palestinians of money that's actually theirs, those tax receipts, do you make all of that contingent on their immediately renouncing, Hamas is immediately renouncing this one position? Now, it seemed to me that, first of all, if you're going to indeed make a contingent on that, you're basically saying we're just not going to recognize them, because it seemed to me no way they were going to turn around overnight, right, and throw away, you know, a long-standing doctrine. It would have been a little awkward, but
I don't know. Okay, yeah.
But anyway, the current, to bring us up to the present moment.
Yeah. So
we didn't recognize them, whether or not for that reason. Things got tense between Fatah, the relatively moderate, relatively moderate Palestinian faction, and Hamas, and something very close to civil war happened, and there's still killing, like a 5-year-old kid was killed yesterday or something, and then Saudi Arabia stepped in and brokered the creation of a unity government, Fatah Hamas, and seriously slowed the progression towards civil war.
Yes.
And now the question again is, do we bolster the unity government by recognizing it or something, and one virtue of that possibly, in my view, being preventing a civil war on the Palestinian side, or do we maintain our position? And the situation today is Israel is maintaining the position per se, and America is being a little more experimental than Israel would like right now, I think, right? I mean, Condi Rice is doing the shuttle diplomacy. She's not talking to Hamas per se, but she's talking to the Fatah part of the government. And Israel doesn't want to talk about much of substance to the Fatah part of the government at all. And in any event, I think they're kind of worried about Condi Rice right now, right?
Well, yes, I think that's correct. Let me just, here's my thing. I don't think it's asking Hamas that much to at least lie to the Israelis. I mean, it seems to me that if you want to get into final status negotiations about a Palestinian state, you should recognize that there will be a Jewish state. And it's not asking that much. I mean, it doesn't cost much. We've seen Arafat do it. And if Hamas, I mean, and I think that the policy that really hurts Hamas is that the pressure that the U.S. has put on Arab banks not to deal with Hamas. So the Palestinian Authority effectively has been cash-strapped. And that has not so far persuaded or pressured Hamas to take the position that they should recognize Israel. But I don't think it's asking that much to renounce violence against Israel, recognize that there should be a Jewish state, and then, stop doing things like abducting their soldiers who are not even in your territory, or, bringing or shooting, these Qassam rockets into Israel. I mean, which is to say that the Palestinian people freely elected a party that represented war with Israel, and if they can't get the best of both worlds, they can't get, we're going to say that we want war with Israel, but at the same time, the Israelis are going to pretend that we're really a peace partner. I mean, it seems to me that if they want the benefits of being a peace partner, then they should stop saying they're at war and they want to destroy Israel. I mean, isn't that reasonable?
Well, it seems to me that in saying it should be easy for Hamas to turn around and say we recognize the state of Israel, you're kind of acting as if Hamas were just this very unified thing, just kind of like as if it was one person.
No, I know that there's a military...
Right. And it was completely autonomous. Right. I mean, if you look, first of all...
There's an Iranian wing and a Syrian wing. No, I'm just kidding.
Exactly.
Right,
I mean, there's a number of things. I mean, we're talking about individual politicians who face a whole complex set of incentive structures. One of them is, how have they acquired as much power as they have? Now, first of all, one thing Americans don't understand is a lot of it, if you look at their mainstream support within Palestine, a lot of it is just that they're good at doing hospitals and community services.
It was a vote. It was a vote against the kleptocrats of Fatah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yes. But they also they draw support on the street from some radical guys who really don't want to recognize the state of Israel, right? In other words, there is part of their constituency, and it's an important part, even if it's small, because when push does come to shove, and they're actually fighting Fatah, these are the guys they count on, okay? The fanatics.
Sure, absolutely,
and
it's a tough spot.
And if they turn around and say, we were just kidding, we actually recognize the existence of the state of Israel, they've got a really serious internal political problem on their hands, and that's leaving aside the fact that, as we said, there's a more radical wing based in Syria that would certainly exploit that opportunity to increase its relative influence within Hamas. So it's a very complicated picture, right?
Well, I mean, just like we had in Ireland the real IRA and then the IRA, you know, I mean, the IRA eventually understood that if they wanted to end the British occupation and they wanted to get independence and political independence, then they were going to have to recognize the rights of Protestants, and they were going to have to, at a certain point, make a kind of political accommodation as a condition for sitting down and negotiating. And I think that in this case, you know, that you can't. I mean, it would be nice if Hamas, if this unity government did come around to striking a final kind of agreement with the Israelis, and there was two states living side by side in peace. But I just don't see how you can ask the Israelis to begin talking about what a map of Palestine would look like with a group of people who are committed to destroying the Jewish state. I mean,
well, wait a second. If you believe that actually over the next year or two or three, while they talk things out, you could slowly alter the incentive structure of Hamas's leaders, especially the ones in the Palestinian government, and increase their power relative to the radical wing. If you believe that that's possible, why would it? And you would still insist that, of course, you not sign a deal until Hamas has recognized the existence of the state of Israel. Then why wouldn't you go ahead and start talking?
Well, because at a certain point, you don't even know. I mean, I have to tell you something. If you've got an industry that is still, if you've got there's a Department of Martyrdom Affairs in the Palestinian Authority. It was created actually under Arafat. And I thought you didn't have a very good deal with Arafat, which is that he would say one thing in English and another thing in Arabic, and at the end he obviously didn't take. But you can't have, you can't be preparing your population for, you know, war. And, you know, giving, and being quite open that, you know, at a certain later point we may unleash lots of suicide bombers. And then also say, you know, you'd like to sort of seek a political solution. Now, in the case, the extraordinary thing about it, if I could just read, the extraordinary thing about Abu Mazen and Mahmoud Abbas is that he actually stood up in the Palestinian legislature and said, this strategy of sending the suicide bombs to Israel isn't working. We can't do it. We have to reach a sort of political and use diplomacy and so forth. I don't think that that's an unreasonable position, and I don't even think that it's necessarily unpopular. And by the way, those street toughs that you pointed out in Gaza and Ramallah, I mean, those are the people that under the Oslo Accords are terrorists. So, I mean, those people, you know, aren't going to be part of a final peace anyway.
Well, I mean, it depends. I have a sufficiently cynical view of human nature to think that actually, ultimately, people are quite malleable, and they tend to do things in the long run that allow them to preserve or enhance their social status and so on. So I just have this kind of cynical view of human nature. I'm not sure how many of them are beyond the pale. Some are, and what you ultimately want is enough power in the hands of moderates in Palestine so that you can at least round up the remaining radicals and put them in jail or suppress their activity. But I think if you have a realistic understanding of the current political landscape in Palestine, you recognize that that's just not doable right now. That's not the way the opinion is arrayed across the Palestinian landscape.
So why would negotiations with Israel, like, why not say no negotiations? You're not going to get anything you like until you handle your own problem in your own house, and that it's not acceptable for you to tell 5-year-olds to blow us up. I mean, what's wrong with that?
We can say it. As I said, my view of the current situation in Palestine is that's just not going to be productive. I mean, saving face is a really big part of human affairs.
Sure.
And I mean, first of all, if you are going to say that to Hamas, if you are going to emphasize that, look, you know, we're not going to do X, Y, Z until you recognize Israel, but we will do it then. I think you're better off not saying it publicly, getting it to them privately, because when you've said it publicly, you've made it even harder for them to comply without losing face. But I'd like to get back to my original question to you, which is this. If you accept the premise that in the course of several years of negotiations, you could have sufficiently moderating influence on Palestine that the radicals were containable, and maybe you don't accept that premise, but if you accept that premise, why would you not start talking to them now?
Well, I don't understand the question. My point is that it's obviously you're going to negotiate. There's going to be things that you negotiate, and they say you don't negotiate with your friends. You negotiate with your enemies. But it's not just a matter of Hamas hasn't said the words. I mean, Hania's speech before the unity government was a very provocative one against Israel. And I can't quote exactly what he said, but it was
it was about resistance continuing.
Resistance continuing, and then there were there were other documents that Hamas had written, like this prisoners document that said, all right, we're going to agree not to conduct terrorism or resistance inside of pre-67 Israel. And then there was an earlier version of the sort of charter of the new unity government that said, no, we have a right to resistance until we pretty much get what we want. So there was a series of these sorts of things that struck me that, Hamas is not really even, they're not making a gambit even for necessarily peace. It just strikes me that this is more talk of what they call a hudna, which is that this is there's a temporary refraining from hostility, and then they're going to come up with some new sort of attack. And at least that's the fear of a lot of Israelis, and they felt, you have to also understand that the peace camp itself in Israel, the Israeli left, felt very burned by, Arafat's decisions at the end of the Camp David II meetings in 2000, which is...
That's an argument for another day.
I know,
I wrote a Slate piece once arguing that was not actually such a great deal, that the Palestinians... Well, it wasn't so good, but and I can link to it. Don't get into that argument. But...
Yes.
But I mean, I think American Israel went about as far as was politically feasible. I don't mean it would have been easy to kind of do the deal. I just mean from a Palestinian perspective, it wasn't as great as it's commonly portrayed. We can link to that, but But I guess I would just say, I mean, first of all, you're still talking about Hamas as if it were this unified thing. That's the way I still hear you analyzing their behavior. And I would encourage you to see the situation more complexly.
I'm aware of the Khalid Mashal versus, I understand.
Totally. And so when, quote, Hamas does something, you shouldn't assume that refers to, that reflects the views of Hania. And secondly, because we have shut them out, we have not even started engaging in the most seductive kind of things we could, direct his way, which is to say, once a guy is head of what's being thought of as kind of an actual government, even though Palestine still wouldn't be a state yet, and he starts going to international conferences and being treated with respect, and the people see that, the incentive structure can change. I mean, the Palestinian people can start taking pride in how they're being treated, and it can become clear that, if this is going to go on for years and years and years, you're going to have to start behaving like a responsible international actor. I think this is part of the whole process by which you would alter the guy's incentive structure and get the Palestinian people to like the prospect of moderate behavior. But, whereas if we keep, maintain his status as an outcast, which I think you're assured to do as long as you sit there and say, hold a hammer over his head and say, now accept the right of Israel to exist. It's just I don't think politics allow him to do that.
It's not just accept the right of Israel to exist. It's so much. It's a bit more than that too. It's stop, smuggling rockets and firing them into Israel. It's stop making war. Stop, give back the people you abducted. It's just, if people want to vote for the war party that runs candidates saying, the mother of three martyrs and so forth, that celebrates this really awful tactic and so forth, and everything like that. And if they want, and they're going to in part vote for that as well as obviously against the kleptocrats and the fact and so forth. Then I don't know, Bob. Don't you think that if they're going to vote for war, then why should Israel necessarily win? Especially since it's an extraordinary development happened the year before in that the leader of Likud, one of the people who's a founder of the settlement movement, decided to withdraw unilaterally from territory, thus ending largely the political argument in Israel that the Jewish state was entitled to all the land it won in the 1967 war. That's a pretty big deal, and it was met with Hamas. I mean, I don't know. It seems to me that it's a very long conflict, and it's a shame, and it would be nice if there was a peace conflict, but this kind of jihadism, which is so, which I understand that you're saying that there's different elements of Hamas and so forth, but you know, and I know, that there's also a sort of, there's a bizarre kind of like, I don't know, this is not the secular Palestinian, movement for self-determination of that we could point to figures in the 70s and the 1980s. It has morphed in many ways to a kind of unrelenting and irredentist and Islamist movement that I don't know that it's even interested at the end of the day in anything. I mean, I just think that I have no reason to think at this point, based on the behavior of the Hamas in Gaza at this point, that they're interested in anything more than a tactical ceasefire in order to gain some sort of advantage later on in what they see as this long war. And if that's the case, then I just don't understand why Israel should not hope to try to get other people who might be interested in a deal in power or wait until then. I mean, perhaps you're right. I don't know.
Let me say three quick things. I would agree with you, I think, to the extent that you want to focus on the things that you mentioned, like are they smuggling weapons in? Are they sponsoring terrorism? I think those are things in the short run you can hold them pretty accountable for, with due respect for the fact that at this point the situation over there is so chaotic that probably Hamas itself is not going to be able to stop every terrorist attack, if Islamic Jihad or whatever, right? I mean,
fair enough.
I think ultimately there's going to have to be a certain amount of forbearance in the best of conditions on Israel's part in that sense. In other words,
well, hence the easy thing of just saying, we'll renounce terrorism for now. We'll at least lie to you. At least have the decency to lie.
I would ask more than that. I would say renounce it and do what you can and recognize that a little of it's going to happen anyway. But I think that's a much better thing to focus on than getting them to renounce the core of their ideology overnight.
Okay,
quickly, I would say on the Sharon withdrawal from Gaza thing. I mean, first of all, I don't read his motivations as being anything but those of a realist who maintains what goal. I mean, he saw that the demographic tide, where the demographic tide was turning, I think, and he realized he had to sever off a big chunk of the Palestinian population for starters. And in any event, as far as how Hamas responded, you say he withdraws from Gaza, and what did they do? They vote for Hamas. He withdrew from Gaza, and here actually I think my critique in some ways dovetails with people on the Israeli right. He withdrew from Gaza under circumstances guaranteed to empower Hamas because it was unilateral. He didn't negotiate, and I mean, I think he should have at least gone through the motions of a sham negotiation with Fatah, acting like, really, I'm serious, acting like he was doing it in exchange for the behavior of something the moderates had done. As it was, he looked like he was chased out by the terrorists, and so of course Hamas is empowered.
Well, my point though is the larger, maybe this doesn't matter, but just as Hamas is not a single entity, we certainly know Israeli politics are not a single entity, and it's a fairly big deal for a guy like Ariel Sharon before he suffers from the stroke to say effectively, I was wrong about trying to build all those settlements. Which is what that said, and that the Jewish state does not have a claim to all its territory that it won, and that significantly puts a dent in one of the idea of having greater Israel. That to me strikes me as a fairly significant kind of political shift in Israel that could have been taken advantage of that effectively wasn't, and then now we're seeing a belated reaction from a lot of the Arab governments like Saudi Arabia, renewing this offer that they have, but I mean, I was in Cairo at the time when all this was happening, and nobody even knew about it. It was not talked about. It was just sort of this thing that happened. That and anyway, so I thought that
you mean the Gaza withdrawal?
Yeah, I'm saying that it was very significant from the perspective of the Israeli right to have Sharon being responsible for what they would say is sort of the retreat from the territory that they didn't see any reason why they should give. And throughout the entire Oslo process, Sharon never agreed to the idea of the formula of land for peace. He was the last holdout. And now you've got, all the founders, left, having agreed to that two-state solution, in effect. So I think that's fairly significant.
Okay. Well, listen, we've been talking an hour and 4 minutes, and we've gotten
cover
through
anything else? Yeah.
2 of it in Vision 6. If you want to pick one remaining topic.
Let me go to my, okay. What did you have in mind? I could talk about whatever. This is fascinating. I could talk about whatever you wanted. We want to talk about something political with Hegel. Is that good?
Sure. Hegel is a fascinating character to me.
Yes.
Now, you were particularly intrigued by his seeming to suggest that the impeachment of a Republican president would be in order or something.
Well, if you actually look at what he says, and he sort of hints at it. He's like, it's a classic politician move, right? It's saying, well, people are saying, if he doesn't listen to Congress, he could get impeached. Not me, but I'm just saying that's what I hear. And you're wondering, is he hanging out with Dennis Kucinich and John Conyers? Hegel's an interesting guy. There's a theory on Hegel that is just something to keep in mind. He has talked and talked and talked. He's been very critical of the president, particularly on the war and the larger sort of foreign policy issues, a lot of which we discussed today. And he sounds like somebody who, if he wasn't a senator, would be like a senior resident fellow at the New America Foundation. But if you notice how he votes, he's always voted pretty much with the Republicans. And the most significant thing is that he said yesterday on ABC's This Week, on Sunday, that he no longer is going to promise his vote to what he sees as a failed policy in Iraq. So I guess that's it is significant, because he voted on the procedural matters with the Republicans. He also voted against the Reid amendment in the Senate about 2 weeks ago, which called for the timeline. He voted to confirm Bolton out of committee. These are things that, Hegel's on the record saying, I don't like Bolton, I don't like the war, and so forth. But he voted for the Republicans.
That was another case where he did a lot of talking.
He did a lot of talking, but the vote is always kind of with his party, which is why I don't even know what he's trying to do. I don't think he's running for president. I can't figure it out, to be honest with you.
Well, it was the same with the Iraq War.
Yeah.
A lot of people now voted for the Iraq War and say, well, they have various kinds of regrets. Well, Hegel really did have doubts at the time.
Yeah.
I actually encountered him at a dinner of the Israel Policy Forum, and just exchanged words with him. But it was clear he had real doubts about the war, and yet, as you say, of course, it's not unusual for politicians to be faithful to their party in their voting, notwithstanding doubts. But are you suggesting this is in some ways reflects more on his character or political nature than with many, or what?
Well, what I think is an untold story is that most Republicans who started off with doubts about the surge in December ended up voting with basically with the president and Mitch McConnell earlier this month when it came to the sort of showdown on that round of resolutions. And based on my reporting today, he's probably going to get most of these votes on the supplemental budget as well. So the Democratic strategy of trying to pick off Republicans who had soured on the war only worked in the sense that they got Gordon Smith in the Senate and they got Walter Jones and I think Wayne Gilchrist in the House. So it's pretty extraordinary that Republicans kind of came home to a certain extent on the war. But then here's Hegel after, he's sort of always voted but still talked a lot, threatening this week to drop an amendment with Jim Webb, the bête noire of the conservative Republicans, another former Republican himself, and that's going to call for the redeployment. He was very vague. I guess we will see more of that today or tomorrow. So it seems to me that Hegel is sort of announcing his independence from the party in some ways.
Well, on the one hand, I'm inclined to say if he wants to be president, he better. My sense is, he's.
Do you think he's got a chance to be president?
I don't. I tend not to, but people who are not crazy seem to think he does. What I don't. You know more about
I nominate Schopenhauer for vice president. Yeah.
you know more about all this Washington politics than I do, and so I kind of have a question for you. What I hear is his domestic politics is very conservative, and I gather that means both on social issues and economic issues, right?
Yes, he's a social conservative. He doesn't like taxes, and but as far as I mean, you could argue that his international. I mean, he's a pretty much. It's not fair to say he's an isolationist. He just agrees with an old group called USA Engaged. Do you know that they were actually?
No, I don't.
USA Engaged were a bunch of corporations that were against some of the secondary sanctions bills against Iran and Cuba. And they were largely from Republican constituency. Caterpillar was part of that, Halliburton, and Hagel was one of their champions. That's not to say, and incidentally, so was Dick Cheney when he was the CEO of Halliburton. And they just sort of went around on the Hill and they said, look, we've got too many sanctions on the books, and this is really bad for American business, and it's not getting us anywhere, and they're not changing American behavior. And it was a fairly kind of acceptable Republican position before the Bush administration. And I think that Hagel really does fall in line sort of there in terms of foreign affairs.
Yeah, I mean, a question is there a constituency? I mean,
CEOs.
assuming he had his... What's that?
CEOs, that's a constituency.
I didn't hear you.
The CEOs.
Oh, well, yeah.
Corporate
bosses. In terms of winning an election, is there a constituency that is conservative on domestic issues and the social issues the way he is, and also kind of shares his foreign policy? And, I mean, suppose he could run as an independent. I mean, maybe if there is no such large constituency, his best chance is to run as an independent and then just be less undesirable than the two candidates that get nominated.
Well, maybe he's running to be Mike Bloomberg's vice president.
Well, although he's got a funny way of showing it, I mean, you would think he would want to establish a certain amount of party loyalty, and he's saying some kinds of things that could complicate that.
Well, no, I think if Bloomberg runs as an independent.
Oh, you mean if he runs as an independent?
Yeah, and then Hagel runs as like a liberated Republican. And, and with him and kind of, confers his senatorial gravitas to the mayor of New York. And maybe that's the formula. But the other thing I would say is that what's interesting is that along the conservative and the Republican base, if you listen to the talk radio shows, the big ones, every Republican that was talking about voting against the surge was just savaged, and it put them in a very difficult position if they were running in 2008. Norm Coleman said he had his doubts and didn't want to support what he said, occasionally would call an escalation, and eventually he voted with his party and the president after people like Hugh Hewitt came out against him. So I think that Hagel kind of realizes he's never going to win those people anyway, so he might as well seek out other voters, and if the Iraq War gets even worse, or if it gets worse and there's more of a catastrophe, then he looks like a genius, right?
Could be, yeah.
That's the formula.
Yeah, no, I mean...
Hegel's banking on America's failure in the Middle East and Iraq.
I mean, people, even people who have honest doubts and honest views cannot help but be in that position politically in some cases.
Yeah, no, I mean that's probably...
And I do think he has the... like I said, I mean, I encountered him before the Iraq War.
Yeah.
His doubts are genuine.
Yeah.
He definitely is very worried about a quagmire.
Right. But the better Petraeus does, the worse Hegel does. Politically.
Yeah, I think so. And the better McCain does.
Yes.
And the worse the Democrats do. And I thought from the beginning it was a political mistake for the Democrats to do anything that could give them ownership of kind of an outcome in the war, the way these the things they're doing in Congress have done.
Well, can I ask you a question before we go?
Sure.
Do you think that had Bush called for the significant withdrawal of troops from Iraq in a sort of rapid way, that you would see a lot of Democrats emerge saying you can't just betray Baghdad to these ethnic cleansers? Which I think is by the way, it aligns perfectly with the sort of traditions of a lot of liberal Democrats, particularly Hillary, Joe Biden, and others. I sort of thought that had it gone that way, you would see a lot of resistance in the other direction.
Well, as I said, I don't have a really great understanding of Washington politics, so it's hard for me to understand, to answer the question specifically, but in its generic form, if you're asking me how cynical am I about human nature, the answer is pretty.
Yes, okay, all right.
It wouldn't surprise me if a few of those would have popped up. But I actually have no idea who they would be.
Okay. Well, I share your pessimism.
Okay. And I would expect, you see about that much of that kind of behavior on the Republican side in other circumstances.
Sure.
Okay, well, this has been fun. You didn't manage to get me quite as animated as Mickey gets me. That is to say, I don't think there's any footage here that I'm going to regret the existence of.
I love Ann Coulter. I just want to say that. No, I'm kidding.
I'll react to that off camera, okay?
Right.
Okay, well, this has been fun.
All right, thank you.
See you around, Elon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.